BBC London News, 35 beatings before domestic violence is reported. Now, your old mobile phone could save lives.
One time he actually pinned me down to the floor and he had an axe over my head and he said, "I'm going to kill you." He threw things at me. I'd get drinks poured over my head.
Advice 2 for women suffering from mental or physical abuse, that's coming up.
An estimated 1 in 4 women will experience it in their lifetime.
Massive media coverage of domestic violence is sweeping the UK, Europe and the States, and there are plenty of vultures around to capitalise on it. Even Jamelia cashes in with her cute track. According to every news story, advert, campaign or speech you'll hear about domestic violence, men are the perpetrators, women are the victims. End of story, good night Vienna. But is that really it? Is that the whole story? I'm not so sure. It seems to me that domestic violence is nothing like as simple as it's presented. Domestic violence, where it actually occurs, is surely an issue that affects people, not an issue that affects only women. It turns out that when you begin to look into domestic violence and assess the figures, it becomes clear that women actually commit more acts of violence than men do, and women are particularly guilty when it comes to violence against children and babies. Why do we never see this on the BBC News? We're never told these things and many others. We can't be told, because that would detract from the purposes of those who seek to craft a very particular message against men for very particular reasons. To these people, men are only allowed to be guilty of domestic violence. All evidence to the contrary be damned. The government knows the truth, and the people that control the media know. In fact, anyone that works in the domestic violence industry knows. And yet, despite all of this knowledge about the truth of domestic violence, it's presented exclusively as a male-on-female phenomenon. The question is why? Why is the male aggressor, female victim paradigm the only story ever told about domestic violence? For example, the modern-day understanding of the rule of thumb. Feminism tells us that the rule of thumb was that a man was permitted in law to beat his wife with a cane, so long as it was no thicker than the width of his thumb.
I just don't think I could bear to be a married woman and give up all my assets to a man who was legally allowed to beat me and rape me and whom I couldn't divorce.
How can this woman actually believe that it's ever been accepted in society for men to beat and even rape their wives? How can she believe that men would ever want to be like this? How many other women believe something so ridiculous? Never in English law has wife beating been legal. What happened was that a single judge in England around 1782 did indeed make a statement approving of a man disciplining his wife, and at the time his view was dismissed and was publicly embarrassed. That's why we even know about this one comment from one judge 230 years ago, because of the newspaper records ridiculing his opinion. Women were never oppressed in this way. An example of real oppression that was occurring at that time was actually against husbands, not wives. Until the 1900s, if a woman committed a tort, which is a civil crime such as failure to pay a debt, her husband was punished for it. Men were held to account for anything any member of their family did, and this could include his imprisonment for his wife's behaviour. But this suppression of men received no modern-day attention whatsoever, compared with many stories of female oppression in years past. What makes the rule of thumb a particularly malicious slur against all men and masculinity is that the opposite has always been true. The male code has always included, never hit a woman.
I would feel like less of a man. I would feel like some kind of wimpy girl man.
Did you hit your sister?
No, Ma, I was watching the hockey game
Boy, I don't care what game you were watching. I'm raising men in this house, and men do not hit women.
Most men are not going to hit a woman at the end of the day. If she's starting something, then they'll attack me. That's the way it works.
Women have always been able to count on protection from men, and still do. The myth of the rule of thumb is a hate crime against men, and there are many others. The story put out by the media, charities and government is that there are in fact legions of evil men, virtually holding their women prisoner and regularly battering them.
A domestic violence epidemic is sweeping Britain. And this is what Stone called his attitude adjuster. It's a pickaxe handle. Here Stone had written "Mind your head," and on the other side he'd written "attitude adjuster."
The idea that a man who hits a woman with a pickaxe handle is typical of domestic violence is like saying that September 11th was a typical morning in New York. It doesn't make sense. Of course this is not domestic violence. This man is clearly deep in the land of crazy and that's the end of it. Why would our media be trying to present the outlandish behaviour of one man as an example of the suffering of countless women? Perhaps the best approach in tackling the inaccurate view of domestic violence that we're presented with is to ask the immortal question posed by Cicero in ancient Rome. When attempting to deduce who was responsible for a crime, he asked, "Cui bono?" Who benefits?
Indeed. Who benefited?
When you look at who benefits most from a crime, it's often easy to work out who committed the crime. So who benefits from men being wrongly singled out as abusive? Who benefits from labelling women as victims and men as perpetrators? And how do they benefit? It's by asking these questions and following the money trail that we begin to get some answers.
Cui bono? Oh, I think we know.
For example, I came across this story featuring Anita Roddick.
It's the idea of Anita Roddick, the founder of The Body Shop. She's asking people to donate their old phones at any of her stores.
And what's this envelope? That's for old mobile phones that are broken or not in use anymore.
They'll then be specially converted and given to women at risk.
This will be very affected and in a very, very vulnerable time for women. He continues to stalk, he continues to threaten her with a lie, usually cuts the phone wires.
But I found this strange because I knew that the Body Shop Foundation had donated money to the Mankind Initiative, a charity with the principal role of assisting men who are victims of domestic violence. So why was she on the BBC talking exclusively about female victims, whilst quietly, behind the scenes and off-air, her company is helping men affected by domestic violence? If she really wanted to help these desperate women, why didn't she just open a free post service to return old phones? Why does she want women to personally go into her shops and hand in phones? This news article I came across explained it. The Body Shop had been having a hard time in business and it sorely needed a boost. Was she using the issue of domestic violence as a tool to gain free advertising on the BBC and to get women into her shops to spend money? As we'll see, that's very much the real story behind domestic violence in the news. Massive income generation. Domestic violence is big, really big. It's a hot topic that shows no signs of abating. And on the very same train platform. To see how big it is, just search on domestic violence and see what comes up. In fact, don't type domestic violence, this is bigger than that. Just type the word violence. Now ask yourself, how can domestic violence against women possibly be the first result on a global search on the word violence? This alone should give you an inkling that there's something rotten in the state of Denmark. Given a search on the whole subject of violence, domestic violence results should be on page 25, if even listed at all. Yet there it is, ranked above all other violence perpetrated throughout the world and throughout history. Above street crime, above wars, above even terrorism. Somehow, above all of the kinds of violence perpetrated overwhelmingly against men, domestic violence against women trumps them all. In the UK, domestic violence against women has been a major point of social consensus over the last 40 years. Journalists, agony aunts, police officers and Home Office ministers have all decided, against the empirical evidence, that huge numbers of men beat their wives and girlfriends, and that women who reported violence to the police were just the tip of the iceberg. Certain people and groups have a lot to gain from exaggerating the problem. Among these are counsellors, domestic violence experts, businesses focusing on women's products, certain charities, and various arms of government, including the prison service and the police. Collectively, this group of beneficiaries of domestic violence can be termed the abuse industry. The more that we're all persuaded to believe that lots of men bash their women, the more money these people receive, the more powerful they become. And we're talking hundreds of millions of pounds every year in the UK. And in the US, it's billions.
The abuse industry maintains itself by defining more and more behaviours, categorising more behaviours, normal behaviours, as acts of abuse. So, for example, whereas 30 years ago, the NSPCC was concerned with the killing and severe beating of children. It's now concerned with smacking children, shouting at children. It has even tried to suggest that 5-year-old boys who have an interest in 5-year-old girls are paedophiles. It's actually used those words. They're not my words, they're the NSPCC's words. Feminist movement has tried to demonise men by counting as acts of domestic violence, shouting, attempting to commit suicide as an act of domestic violence, according to the Domestic Violence Project.
So these people have massaged some of the facts. They've invented other facts and ignored those awkward facts that were contrary to their purposes. They've published countless figures for domestic violence. None of the figures are small, and all of them appear to confirm the existence of a vast and menacing problem, a problem that only appears to affect women. But what is it? What is domestic violence? If you think that it means a man, woman or child being beaten up, punched or kicked, then you're mistaken. Domestic violence as presented in the media is actually something very different. It's defined as a wide array of behaviours, most of which are not actually violent at all.
From the publicly funded domestic violence project working at the Royal Holloway College, here are some examples of domestic violence, what they count. Refusing to have sex with her as an act of domestic violence, denying her sexuality, mocking or humiliating her, watching her at home or work. I'm not making these up. Sending her unwanted gifts, telling her children things she doesn't want them to know. These are all acts of domestic violence, according to our government. Swearing at her, insulting her, criticising her appearance, criticising her... Well, it just goes on and on. This is the abuse industry growing, trying to bring as many forms of normal behaviour as possible under the category of domestic violence.
I think it's been trivialised down to whether slapping, kicking, punching and all the rest of it. That is, of course, it's sad that adults have to regress into childish behaviour, but it does happen. Domestic violence, to me, is where there is physical attacks on another human being from someone who is close to you and loves you, or supposed to love you.
Some of the literature on that has tended to kind of overstate the case. So, and they tended, if you look at some of the literature, they tend to sort of stretch the definition of abuse, not just from punching and kicking or injuring in other ways, but to just sort of name calling or nasty looks, which name calling and nasty looks are not nice, but it kind of, you don't want to stretch the definition too far.
The Domestic Violence Project at the Royal Holloway College. This is a £3 million project funded by the Labour government, which is run by an American feminist who knows every trick in the book. I've even received emails from women telling me that my website is illegal because it's an act of domestic violence against women. You cannot complain against women without them feeling that they have a right to abuse you, to threaten you, to intimidate you. And when it comes to the mainstream media, newspapers and whatever, they won't receive a few emails, they'll receive thousands of emails, thousands of letters orchestrated by the feminist lobby, which you must remember is extremely well funded. And so the women are goaded into believing that they are being abused by the male population, when the truth of the matter is, as you can see from to the depths that they're having to sink in order to define domestic violence in every which way they can, and these things are regarded as crimes.
I got into an argument with someone a couple of months ago, and she was very sensible, and she worked in a, it wasn't kind of like a rape crisis centre or something, but it was a sort of kind of a resource centre for those kinds of things. And she was coming out with all this stuff like, it's 1 in 4 women are abused, and I'm thinking, wow, that's massive. So I said, does that mean that of all of your friends, a quarter of them are being abused? And she went, well, no, I mean that over their whole lifetime, so not any given time. I said, okay, and what exactly counts as abuse under? What do you mean by abuse? Because this seems like an epidemic of what's going on. He said, oh, well, it means, obviously, knifing and stabbing and stuff, and murder, obviously, punching and kicking, and then also name calling and ignoring and stuff like this. So what it actually boiled down to was that over that whole spread of things, it meant that 1 in 4 women over the course of their lives will be ignored for a period of time by their partners. It's kind of unfortunate if energy directed towards solving really serious problems is kind of dissipated on silly stuff like that.
It started off really, he threw things at me. I'd get drinks poured over my head, rubbish bin, he'd quite often do that sort of thing, just tip the rubbish over my head if I was sitting down.
Pouring rubbish over a woman's head is not domestic violence. It sounds more like some sort of personality disorder to me. And did he really do this for no reason? It'd be interesting to have the lovely Bryony on film to ask her what part she played in events. But women are never asked to do that,
When questioned, 47% of women living in London say they'd leave their partner straight away if he hit her. In reality, it takes an average of 35 beatings before they actually report the violence.
Despite this reporter's misuse of the word beatings, this doesn't mean 35 punches or 35 slaps or 35 of any other kind of physical assault. As we've seen, it could mean anything. It's even extended to include financial domestic violence. This means wherever a man refuses to give money to a woman, for whatever reason, he's classed as abusive. I wonder, if I beat her at chess, is that intellectual domestic violence? If I beat her on PlayStation, is that video game domestic violence? The definitions of domestic violence are now so wide that the figures have become meaningless.
The classification for domestic violence covers all acts of whether it's slapping, punching, pinching, if financial deprivation, in other words, if your partner won't give you the money that you want, that you think, that's all considered domestic violence. The problem with this is that if you start doing that, you're going to end up with the entire population of England in prison, because unfortunately people who live in close relationships do at times behave very badly towards each other. Domestic violence is, as far as I'm concerned, is serious violence where the other person is so intimidated that you ruin their quality of life.
Psychological violence encompasses various tactics to undermine a woman's self-confidence, such as yelling, insults, contempt, threats, or deprivation of emotional care.
Is it only a woman's confidence that can be undermined?
Elmer! If you're not in here in just 10 seconds, your dinner will go to your family. The Hogs! Elmer! Don't you sneak up on me.
Physical violence ranges from pushing and shoving to hitting, torture, mutilation and murder.
Sounds like Dolores O'Neill. She stabbed her husband 21 times and then smashed his head to a pulp with 26 blows from a hammer. He was asleep when she struck. And of course there's Lorena Bobbitt.
Our next guest is a woman who's famous around the world for literally taking the law into her own hands. It's my pleasure. Welcome, welcome. This is your first appearance on British television, and millions of viewers join me in wanting to know the answer to one question.
Cut any good dicks lately?
Have you ever seen or heard of a man mutilating a vagina? And if you have, would you expect to see him laughing about it on a talk show?
Financial violence may also include preventing a partner from taking employment outside the home or engaging in other activity that would lead to financial independence.
Financial violence? Are you kidding me? So a woman chooses to be with a man who's willing and able to support her financially, and this might be somehow forced on her as a violent act. I wish someone would be financially violent to me so that I could quit work. However, the types of violence that women often employ against men don't make it onto Amnesty's list. But in your mind, when you think about domestic violence, what is it that goes through your mind? What do you think about?
Well, you always think the guy hitting the girl, don't you?
Is that because of maybe what you hear on the news and Trisha and things like that?
Yeah, exactly. The coverage it gets, basically, isn't it?
Women successfully use the belief that domestic violence against women is commonplace in divorce and custody cases, where the mere accusation of domestic violence gives them an advantage.
It's very easy for a woman to prevent a father from raising his child, and the quickest and easiest way to do this is to utter two magic words. Domestic violence, you must hear it all the time to stop dads from seeing their kids.
Well, that's not the only sort of allegation. What about sexual abuse? It's very easy for the mother to say and very difficult for the father to disprove.
Once domestic violence brought into it, that's the most brought up accusation by women, domestic violence. The courts are then believing the woman, and then the minute you go in front of the judge, you're thinking to yourself, do they think that I beat women up? Do they think I do this? Do they think I do that? And you just feel like you're about that big. And I felt about that big for the first few times. It's only when I thought, sod this, I've got dignity, I've not done nothing wrong.
In your experience, how many of the allegations of abuse or violence are substantiated?
Well, I think that's a very difficult question. I would think probably not a lot.
Women's Aid was sat there for one reason and one reason only,
and that was to make sure that after divorce or separation, wherever humanly possible, those fathers did not see their children again. That was their single overriding objective.
Do you know anything
and if they could use domestic abuse as the reason for it, let's use it. What you need to realise is that when you've finally achieved your objective, a legal presumption of contact, I said, your next roadblock, I said, is going to be domestic violence. I said, and that's why we're working on it now.
Ms. Jenkins says she is afraid of you. You are obsessive, aggressive and unpredictable, showing no regard for the emotional needs of your child or her mother.
That's not true.
No?
Times the police were called, Miss Green never had one mark on her and always had me that had the cut, because I would not smack her back. I would not hit her back purely and simply because she was a woman.
Do you think that there is a level of domestic violence complaints by women that are untrue?
Yes, it's been hugely abused. It was particularly obvious in Canada. I was there for 6 weeks with Senator Ann Cools, and we travelled all the way across Canada, and we were looking at what they called in the refugees, first step is called hoovering. He comes home from work and finds that she's taken the children and everything she can lay hands on has moved into a local refuge, and he won't be able to find her because no one will tell her where she's gone. And then she instigates, because what happened is domestic violence has become a fast track to divorce. An awful lot of solicitors internationally will say to women, claim that he hit you because this means that you'll get everything.
Your husband, on a prior occasion, had slapped you, beat you. I think that word is not inappropriate.
No,
Let me finish, please. I'm not concerned with who slapped whom first. Your husband, who had beaten you repeatedly.
No,
please.
he never.
Repeatedly.
And then the second thing, if that doesn't work fast enough, they call it the silver bullet in Canada. That means that she claims that he's molested the children. And that means that he's immediately then barred from everything, and the divorce goes straight through, and he loses his children, and he will never see them again.
Well, I know that I had to answer a lot of accusations that were untrue about domestic violence, about my kids are scared of me, about beating my kids up, which were totally fabricated. But I felt that the courts looked upon me as that person. It was just general accusations, punching her 4 times at the top of the stairs, then actually throwing her down the stairs. One of the accusations was that she rolled over while I threw her down the stairs 4 times, yet she managed to get up, drive away, and had no marks on her, never went to the police, which was laughable to a degree, but when it's actually levelled against you, it ain't laughable. It's pretty damn frightening.
The increasingly wide and increasingly shallow definitions all serve to inflate the statistics against men. All men are guilty. Basically anything a man says or does that could conceivably upset a woman is now, officially, domestic violence. But most of these behaviours, when they occur in an intimate relationship, are not considered crimes of violence by those involved. But this is silly. By Harriet Harman's definition, this is a sexual assault.
So it kind of makes for an exciting life, I suppose.
Well, let's say I'm asleep and my wife needs some cash, so she takes £10 from my wallet without my knowledge. Well, I suppose that's technically theft. I don't regard it as a crime. I won't be calling the police about it. In the context of the relationship, it's not a crime, when otherwise it obviously would be. I'd like to ask Miss Harman, should I regard this like theft by a stranger in the street? Should the police prosecute my wife for theft, despite my objection that it wasn't a crime? Should they dust my wallet for fingerprints? Should she spend the night in a jail cell? There is such a serious lack of intellectual rigour in the arguments from Harriet Harman, and similar statements by Baroness Scotland, that I wonder at their senior positions at the Home Office. How did these 2 women achieve these positions with such a demonstrable lack of intelligence? Is this a consequence of women-only shortlists and other affirmative action for female politicians?
And in order to allow progress on women's representation in the House to continue, we'll extend the permission for all women shortlists for parliamentary selection until 2030.
I'm also concerned about women-only lists for Parliament, because effectively, if you get a woman that comes from a female-only list in Parliament, you're going to get substandard people.
Domestic violence was very low priority for the police, and these are some of the reasons why. One of our top police officers in the country in the 80s was saying stray dogs and domestic violence are rubbish work for police officers.
That policeman is absolutely right in what he said. Domestic violence should not be a police matter. But his personal opinion is at odds with the ambitions of the police force as a whole. It is in the police's interest to open up private intimate relationships as a criminal arena. The police want this new area of crime for the same reason that a business wants to open up a new market. It leads to a lot more money. They want to get past the front door. There used to be a social barrier to their power and influence, and invade our private lives.
We can't just go barging into people's apartments. Sadly, with the police, not the dating police.
I also think the police have got nothing better to do. My own belief, 12 policemen turning up to arrest Pete Townsend for his alleged child pornography. Why? They've got nothing better to do. I mean, what do they spend their time doing? Much of the time they have spent in the past chasing around innocuous pot smokers. We have them attending, apparently, so they tell us, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of domestic violence incidents every, I think there are 1,200 a day in this country. Goodness knows how many meetings they have with their politically correct masters to discuss policies and so on. They can afford to have 12 men going around to Pete Townsend. What are they doing? What are they doing? They're over-resourced is the answer.
There are only a limited number of criminals and terrorists, so the police can only argue for so much money. But if the police can successfully create a whole new class of criminal in the shape of every single man in the country, they can get a lot more.
Governments benefit when there's disharmony. The more disharmony, the more badness that there is out there, the more that they can justify, the more the population are fearful, the more they want the governments to protect them, the more funding they give to the government. So the more crime and criminality out there, the worse it is for us, but the better it is for those in power. They benefit from crime. The police benefit from crime. It's wonderful. The more crime, the better, the more jobs they have, the more money, the more funding they get, the bigger do they grow. The bigger do their departments grow, the higher up the ladder they grow, the more important do they become. So they stir it up. They want a war on drugs. They want domestic violence. They love domestic violence. It gives them something to do. But it doesn't, it's of no benefit for the rest of us.
Could you imagine being locked up for the night because you had an argument with your wife?
This is a minor case. The woman hasn't been hit, but the man has caused damage in the house and has been threatening. The officers decide they must take the husband away to avoid any further problems during the night.
I'm not going to leave him here with you tonight. No. So we're going to remove him and take him to the police station.
This is the power the police now have. It boosts their arrest statistics. With more crime comes bigger budgets, higher salaries, more police officers, and shinier cars. Domestic violence is fantastic for the police, because every single man has become easily arrestable, not because of his behaviour, but simply because he's a man.
The police are also very politically correct, that senior officers at the top, by and large, if they're not politically correct, they don't rise any higher.
The statement that domestic violence was rubbish work for the police was undoubtedly that man's Jerry Maguire moment.
The answer was fewer clients, less money, more attention, caring.
Came here to let you go. You said fewer clients, you put it all down on paper. Jesus Christ.
If their primary function isn't to take care of themselves, they will be defeated by organisms whose primary function is to take care of themselves. Two politicians competing within their own party to rise in their ranks. The politician who serves the organism, his party, the most, is the one who's going to rise higher. And this is why the people who get to the top in political parties are always the ones who benefit the organism of their party the most, rather than the ones that benefit the people the most. And I think that we should always be aware of this. If you imagine two political parties, one which is always honest, where the politicians always tell you the truth, they explain the mishaps, they express their doubts, that political party has no hope. Not in comparison to a political party that lies, cheats, swindles, serves itself, keeps everything under the carpet. That party will beat the honest party by a mile, which is why honest politicians, they never rise very high. Honesty doesn't get you anywhere in politics. Serving the organism of which you are a part gets you somewhere. We have created systems whereby those who are honest have no hope of rising high within them. And I think that's important for us to all be aware of.